Okay, great. So I'll just repeat that really briefly. So my name is Joni Kindwall-Moore, and I actually I'm a botanist and I'm also an RN. So I have a kind of interesting combination of career interests that make me very passionate about food and food innovation. I grew up in rural Oregon on a little farm outside of west of Salem. So definitely have farm kid roots, very rural roots. And like Terry mentioned, I several years back, actually in 2015, I founded a company called Snacktivist Foods. And there's a little story as to why, and I'll tell you that at some point. But basically, after years and years of working as a botanist, actually, I'll just tell you right now because that'd be fun. So my early career as a kid, here tromping around rural Oregon, and I was always really interested in the native use of plants for both food and for medicinal purposes. And so I actually pursued in my first career and became an ethnobotanist. So that's a combination of like botany and chemistry and studying how people use plants. My focus was for medicinal purposes, nutraceutical purposes. So I ended up working in pharmaceutical development and in nutraceuticals, which is like the supplement industry. This was all in the 90s. So it was like really kind of the supplement industry was booming in a very different way at that time. And it was a very fascinating experience where I got to travel to some really cool parts of the world. I got to work with shaman down in the Amazon and, bring back plant samples. It was a really interesting experience. But at the end of the day, I really love working with people. And my husband was a nurse, and I was kind of jealous of some of the experiences he would have when he came home from work. And so I ended up pursuing a nursing degree and ended up spending over a decade at the bedside as an ICU and ER nurse. And I did do some time as a diabetic educator as well. And time again, throughout all this, 25 years of career experience, it came down to food. We were doing all these heroic measures at the hospital. We were doing heroic measures when it comes to innovation and discovery of therapeutics when I was a scientist. But at the end of the day, I felt like the foundational level of health being the food system was often overlooked. And so I ended up I have 3 kids, as I mentioned. You'll probably see them running behind me at some point. Um, my son, when he was little, started developing some significant food allergies. And I had always had some food allergies as well. I always tried to drive combine for wheat harvest, couldn't do it because I just get hives and, could not tolerate it. So I always had kind of avoided wheat because of that reaction, and very allergic to eggs too. And as it turns out, my children also have food allergies. So this led me down this whole path of like, what is wrong with our food system? Why are we eating, just a few refined, highly hybridized, products to make like the majority of our grain, like the majority of our caloric intake every day. So like wheat, for example, wheat products make up about 50% of many of people in the world's daily caloric intake. And a lot of that wheat is refined and white and processed and all of that stuff. So no wonder we're having all of these health problems. So this led me into the world of ancient grains. And that's what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about a group of plants all called millets. They're a large botanical group and their role in the broader picture of ancient grains. But first, we're going to just talk about ancient grains a little bit, kind of on a bigger level. Excuse me. So, when you hear about history and you hear about the dawn of civilization, as we've read it in school and read it in the like approved history books, really led us on this narrow picture about what happened when the dawn of agriculture really started. And it's long been considered to be called the Neolithic founder crops. Now, a lot of what the history that we read specifically pertains to the core Neolithic founder crops that were used in the Levant. So that's in the Middle East and the Tigris and Euphrates. Like that's really a lot of the focus of what we hear in history books. And we know that this really started to heat up around 12,000 BC. But one of the things that I've always been really curious about is what was happening in other parts of the world. Clearly, the core crops that were domesticated in the Middle East are not the only crops that were domesticated by early agricultural humans. And by really taking a step back and trying to look at a bigger picture that's not kind of narrow focus just on the Middle East as like the only place where civilization ever happened, we start to see that actually civilization developed in many places around the globe independently of one another. And with those agricultural advancements were development of domesticated plants that were important to humans that were not wheat, flax, and and garbanzos like you hear about in the Middle East. So that's where millets come into play. And early on, I did a lot of studying into what what had happened in our food system where 12,000 years ago we had the dawn of agriculture, and fast forward to 2023 and we have a raging epidemic of food allergies to just common foundational foods in the modern world. So I wanted to unravel a little bit of like what went wrong. Like, how is it that we're at a point now in history where our bodies are rejecting the foundational foods that built human civilization? And that's when I started becoming a huge millet enthusiast, which is like the nerdiest title you could ever earn. But what I found is that there are other millet enthusiasts throughout the world too. And millets have a rich history, just like wheat and emmer and einkorn and flax and like a lot of the classic Neolithic founder crops that you hear about, that just doesn't often get told. So one of the things that I found to be uniquely fascinating is that I've always associated the Chinese, imperial era, like the rich history behind China. I always just thought, okay, surely they subsisted on rice. But as I started doing this historical deep dive, I was very surprised to learn that it was actually millets that built the ancient Chinese empires. And it wasn't until rather recently that the millets fell out of favor in both India and in China as being staples of the people. And that this reliance on rice is actually a recent and somewhat modern phenomenon. That blew my mind when I first heard that. It literally shattered every assumption I had ever had about food and made me step back and reevaluate everything through the lens of this deeper history that goes beyond what we've learned just in the last 500 years, the colonial era, essentially. So ancient grains, like I just alluded to, have come from all over the world. And I'm sure you've all had the ancient grains from the Andes, which is like quinoa and chia, from Middle America and Central America. There is a rich variety of ancient grains that really have developed all over the world. Teff here is from Africa. And what's interesting when you look at like what our food system consists of now is we've taken this diversity of thousands of different plant species that were used for grains. I'm just going to talk about grains today for simplification. But we've narrowed down all of that genetic diversity, all of that biodiversity, and we've actually eliminated in the last just couple hundred years, 90% of all genetic diversity in our cereal crops worldwide. That equates to a 75% loss of all varieties of cereal crops that are consumed worldwide. And so that's a major extinction event. And now our food system is literally focused on corn, wheat, rice, and soy. And that's, the dominant driver of caloric intake globally now. But there is this whole world of forgotten foods that, are very, very significant. And we're going to talk about why they're significant a little bit later. But why do you think that the modern world left these crops behind? I mean, some of these were so important. I mean, they built humongous civilizations. So, we do know that the Green Revolution, middle of the last century, really changed the way the world approached agriculture, because we had the advancements of tractors and advancements in agronomics, fertilizers, irrigation, all of these things that made our whole food system start to shift on reliancy on just a few select varieties of the king crops. And the reason why a lot of these crops became king is because they were highly responsive to fertilizer application. Well, the same people who sell the fertilizers also sell the seeds, because we've stopped relying on our land race varieties. And so we've actually developed this very fragile food system that has a high degree of reliance on artificial inputs, from fertilizers to irrigation to unnatural amounts of tillage, all of these different things. So we have a huge wake-up call that's coming to the world right now, because topsoils globally are eroded. They've been eroding throughout time, but the last 100 years has really hammered them with our intensivity of agriculture. And we also have a global insufficiencies when it comes to fertilizer access, when it comes to petroleum access to run tractors and tillage and things like that. So we have a really disruptive event that we're actually living through today that, to me, my response to it is like, we need to embrace a lot of these forgotten crops that brought a lot of value to ancient civilizations, brought a lot of nutrition, brought a lot of stability. They maybe didn't produce as high of yields, but we've never actually looked into them from a genetic perspective to see if we can increase the yields. Like, they've literally been kind of overlooked by the modern agricultural world. And that's a lot of what my passion point is. And one of the reasons I founded Snacktivist, to try to bring these ancient crops back into our modern dietary patterns. So I mentioned the word landrace. That's a word that not a lot of people know. I honestly wasn't real familiar with this word until a few years ago. But, before we had seed brokers, farmers swapped seeds and they kept seeds. And you're probably all in seed swap groups. I just have a feeling that you're that type of person. You're my kind of people. And you understand why sovereignty is so important. Because when you select year after year for the best traits for your region, you start to get regional specificity. You start to breed the best crop for your location and for your application. So for instance, if I'm growing millet here in like Eastern Washington and I want it for flour, because I'm going to make pastry flour out of it, I'm going to select for a different variety than my buddy over here who's selecting it to make malt for beer, right? So all of that develops robust genetic information. Like, you end up driving genetic diversity that way. And it's called landrace. And that's what you get. You get landrace varieties when you have this, like, season after season selectivity for certain crops that thrive in certain areas. And what's interesting is that we are having a revival in landrace varieties, not only in millets, but because millets have never really like in the areas where they're still grown today in wide air, like in India, there's a lot of landrace varieties of millets, but wheat actually has a lot of amazing landrace varieties too. And Terry and I are well acquainted with some fantastic farmers that are really on the forefront of preserving and growing the landrace varieties of wheat, barley, and other crops as well. So it's a really cool word to kind of be familiar with. So, and I just alluded to this, but the other thing is this open pollination. This idea that we're letting plants pollinate spontaneously and create viable live seeds for the next generation. Where our agricultural system has gone is that many of the staple crops that we consume every day are intentionally sterile. They, for many reasons, they're hybridized to a point where, if there was an issue that prevented the seed companies of the world to delivering seeds globally, we wouldn't be able to turn around and replant the seeds we'd already grown, because they're not going to yield offspring in either, the offspring wouldn't be, of high quality, or it really won't germinate at all. Like, there's lots of different varieties there. But, it's interesting to think that our policy and our public policy, our insurance that dominates our agricultural landscape, it has all been curated to really facilitate the growth of these high intellectual property value seeds that are hybridized. And they've actually worked in many places to make, the spontaneous pollination landrace varieties illegal. Like, you can't get crop insurance on them, those kind of things. So I want everybody to think about that from a policy level, because that is something that's really important. And it's a conversation that's heating up again this year in the Farm Bill. So this takes us to millets. Millets have a very long history. There's very well documented historical evidence that millets were being cultivated throughout Asia and Africa, even 8,000 BC. So, that's 10,000 years ago. I do know some geneticists who actually have theorized and found potential historical record that's indicative that Neanderthals may have been doing some cultivation of millets. Now, that is like, the history professors are going to jump down your throat if you say that. But he has some very persuasive evidence that really got my attention. And in fact, he's going to be talking at our next month's North American Millets Alliance webinar. about this theory, like the deep and early history of millets as ancient grains. Now, millets have a huge variety, and let's just talk about millets for a second. I'm really glad to see that many of you guys knew that there was lots of different types of millets. They're a very rich group of plants. They're not related to one another. I mean, they kind of are, they're like cousins, but just because they're all called millet does not mean they're really related to each other. They are very different genuses, they're very different plants, but they have some unifying qualities about them that give them that umbrella category and why we call them millets. First of all, many of them tend to be small cereals. And again, that's one of the things that favored the larger kernel varieties for modern application and scale in 21st century agriculture. Many of these they're so small, like teff, for instance, it's the same size as a poppy seed. So you can imagine with processing, dehulling, harvesting, etc., it does create some formidable barriers in efficient processing. And those are some things, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but are really important as we modernize our food system and we pay attention to like what's happening in engineering so that we don't leave these critical crops behind. Because, you know, people are innovative and technology is amazing. And when we could get that technological engineering zeal applied to efficiencies in making these small cereals more efficient to grow and process and manufacture, that opens up a whole new world of scaling them for their health and their agricultural significance. I'm going to talk a little bit about sorghum. Sorghum is often called great millet or big millet. I mean, they all have, the nomenclature is a mess in the world of millets. There's so many different names, it makes it very confusing. But sorghum is actually very common in the United States. It's grown throughout the Corn Belt. It's actually, I think the United States is the second largest producer of sorghum globally. But the majority of our sorghum actually goes into ethanol production. And sorghum is an interesting plant in that it can grow very, very big and very, very fast. Some varieties of sorghum are 15 feet tall. And so they do have tremendous application when it comes to fibers, biofuels, like a lot of industrial application. But I'm focused on their food. You know, the sorghum is a high volume producer. And in fact, the sorghum yields can be absolutely fantastic. There's been a lot of agronomy and a lot of cereal science application on sorghums. And, you know, one of the things I want to mention about sorghums for food is that there are varieties of sorghum that produce grain kernels that have the same antioxidant concentration, ounce per ounce, like micrograms of antioxidant to ounce of grain, as you would find in like pomegranates and blueberries. And most people are not aware of this. They have a fantastic nutritional profile, especially as compared to like wheat, or excuse me, compared to rice and corn, where rice and corn tend to be higher in starch but lower in nutrition. Sorghum packs a punch. I mean, even more so than wheat. And wheat is got a pretty dynamic nutritional profile, especially these old world varieties. But sorghum is literally a powerhouse of phytochemicals, and it provides a very high concentration of starches, resistant starches. I had a little brain fart for a second there. Resistant starches. And what we're starting to realize now is that there's this whole new application of cereal use from a dietary standpoint for its role in feeding the microbiome. And one of the things that we know about sorghum is that it does have a high protein content, although the protein is not very well digested. But what comes out of that is it actually creates really good food for our microbiome. And that's something that there's some fantastic research coming out of University of Nebraska-Lincoln, also out of K-State, Kansas State, where they are doing studies about the results of microbiome and dysbiosis correction after people include sorghum in their diet. So there's some fantastic nutritional things. Go ahead, sweetheart. Teenager number one in the house. So I think that we've just begun our dietary exploration of sorghum and other millets for their distinctive use in increasing nutrition in the United States and globally. Sorghum is a staple food in Africa and also throughout India. But it is a fantastic crop. So if you have not tried it, you can get it at bulk pins at health food stores. You can cook it like rice, but it takes a long time. So let's go to teff. We went from the big guy now down to the little guy. So teff is the opposite. It is a very delicate, very elegant plant. It's one of the smallest seeds in the world. But what's fascinating is these tiny little teff seeds, and teff is considered a millet, by the way. It's in the broader category of millets. Um, it grows these fantastic, gorgeous, huge plants. And one of the things that's really great about teff, I mean, sorghum as well, sorghum uses 60% less water than corn, or more, and it's quite drought tolerant. It actually can grow without any irrigation at all. Well, teff takes that like times 1,000. Once you get teff established, it can grow and produce yields under intense heat and drought pressure. And in fact, we actually produce all of our teff here in the Northwest. Most of it is produced in Eastern Oregon and in Idaho and some in Nevada. But our teff producers did some trials down in the Bakersfield, California area in some fields that had, gone fallow because of lack of irrigation with the drought in California. And they had, I think I should ask my husband what it was. I can't remember. It was something crazy, like over 30 days of over 100 degrees with no water for the last month of their lifespan. And they still produced fantastic yields, even under that kind of stress. So this is again why I think that these crops are so key for the future. Also, like sorghum, teff, and other millets do not require the intensive fertilizer needs that say corn and things like that. They play very well in organic systems. So, oh, I must have lost my Proso millet slide. Well, we'll talk about Proso millet here. There are two pictures of Proso millet here. These two on the top, it's like it kind of flips over like this. Proso millet is the most widely grown millet in North America. It's grown throughout the nation, but it's predominantly used in birdseed. So most of us are familiar with it only if you've ever seen it in your bread. Like if you pick up a loaf of Dave's Killer or even some of the local bread brands, you'll find millet in there. It's definitely commonly used, but it's more commonly used in the bird aisle. When you look at those little bird feeders and stuff like that. And one of the issues with Proso millet is that it has a very hard hull. Like it has to be de-hulled in order for humans to consume it. And we have had a very, very low, a very problematic access to de-hulling for millet. So millet is grown throughout the nation, but a lot of farmers either just don't harvest it at all. They just roller crimp it before it goes to seed, or they harvest it and they sell it into birdseed for next to nothing. It barely pays for the harvest. I'm excited about Proso millet because Proso millet has some fantastic nutritional qualities associated with it. Like the other ones I talked about, it's naturally gluten-free. It's got a great nutritional profile, has a lower glycemic index than other grains. So for people who are watching their blood sugar, it has some blood sugar stabilization qualities to it, and it really tastes great. However, one of the things that I get really nerdy about is the role that it plays in agriculture, especially in our home zone, the Northwest. You've probably all been to Eastern Oregon. You've probably all been to Eastern Washington at some point, and you know how dry it is out there. You also know when you go out to like Ione and that area south of Hermiston, south of Pendleton, that's the wheat belt of Oregon. They not only have very hot, dry summers, but they have a very monocrop dominant landscape, just like Eastern Washington. It's almost all wheat, barley, and maybe an occasional canola field. And one of the reasons why I literally get calls from farmers multiple days a week is that they are seeing that they have got to keep that ground covered. When they go out and harvest that wheat in the summer, and then they go out there and they till the heck out of the soil, and suddenly you've got bare soil sitting there from July all the way until they plant winter wheat late in the fall. Well, what happens when you have all that bare ground, super dry, super parched? Every time it gets windy, all that topsoil blows away. If we get a little thunder and lightning storm, it all runs into the river, and it's carrying all that fertilizer, it's carrying all of that beautiful topsoil, and it's degrading the intact microbiome. So a lot of the farmers who contact me are like, hey, if we do a no-till thing, What can we plant into our wheat stubble that will give us a quick harvest, that will grow and go to fruition and be harvested before it freezes again in the fall? And pro-sow millet is one of the most important crops for that role. And it's a very important agronomic application, especially here in the inland Northwest. So it's really a cool thing when you can find something that's nutritious, people like to eat, it's got a great role there. But then on the other hand, it has this significance on the agricultural side by making farmers more responsible about their soil health practices, and also adds a little extra profitability that they wouldn't have by adding one more cash crop to their rotation. Those are the things that are going to really drive innovation in agriculture at scale into the future. So speaking of the future, food in the future. So, for many, many years, our food system has really been kind of dominated by this idea of like, all we care about is yield and calories. We weren't really talking about profitability. We weren't really talking about biodiversity, water, carbon drawdown, soil health, nutrient density, like as far as integrity. We were just like calories in, calories out, yield. And we have a massive shift happening globally, and it's like a freight train, and it has taken off, and it is really trying to build out this true cost accounting around food. Because every time you take a bite of food, there's so many things that it impacts, because it impacts upstream and it impacts downstream. It impacts our health, which ultimately impacts our community and our GDP and our healthcare costs. You literally cannot look at food in a vacuum. It is so interconnected. And so one of the things that I'm working on with Snacktivist, and also with another company that I've founded called Food Vision, is that we're figuring out how we can build in true cost accounting into our food. So not only do we have transparency from soil to plate, but we start to understand both upstream and downstream consequences of our food choices. And this is an interesting concept because food brands don't always do the most responsible practices. They don't always choose the best thing that's going to impact people and planet and communities. But by applying a true cost accounting lens to food, it makes it much harder to pull the wool over people's eyes and to do things that are actually detrimental to our communities, to our bodies, and our planet. So I'm gonna have a quick sip of water. So where do millets come into this? And also climate change. Well, we know that, our world is heating up. And I always say I'm not in the business of arguing about why. I mean, we're coming out of a huge ice age and we know how that goes. And so the climate is warming no matter what we do to it. But then we've also really, really gone in and hit the rapid heat button through human practices over the last few centuries. And so we have a rapidly heating planet on our hands. And one of the things I'm always grappling with as a food innovator and as someone who has children that I hope have food in the future, and multiple generations, whether they're my kids or not, food security is critical to humanity. No food, no people. And so I'm always thinking, like, what are we doing to adapt our food system to climate change? What steps are we making to make sure that we can continue to grow the scale of foods we need to feed 8 billion people on this planet? And this is where I think millets play a very key role. Millets in general, and I only talked about 3, but all millets in general tend to be heat-loving plants. They flourish and they thrive under very intense conditions, which in a heating planet we know is really, really important. I personally believe that right now, innovating to figure out how we can focus on the agronomy of millets to make them more easy to grow, more productive, higher yields, so our farmers feel more confident growing them, and creating the efficiencies in manufacturing, so we know that we're having good food efficiency. And then where I come in, because I'm not a farmer and I don't do manufacturing, innovating to make millets more acceptable to palates around the world is really, really important. And to me, this is one of the big tension points of this whole shift into global future food systems, is how are we innovating to keep up with the change that is needed, as we have, like, the Ogallagua aquifer is drying up. Like, it's happening. It is the biggest aquifer in North America, stretches from Texas all the way up to like Iowa, and it literally irrigates like the world's corn supply. And we know it's actually going dry. In fact, in many places it has already gone dry. So unfortunately, the market has been slow to adapt, and it's still saying more corn, more corn, more corn. And we're pumping more water, more water, more water to feed that corn. I'm like, let's innovate with millet. Let's create more foods that are made from drought resistant plants. And let's swap out some of that corn for sorghum, for instance. We know right off the top, we're going to reduce that water usage by 60%, and we're going to dramatically reduce our fertilizer needs as well. And there are tons of different millets that play different applications in different geographical areas. But what we don't have is we don't have the market moving. We don't have the consumer awareness around millets. We don't have innovation happening that are making millet tortillas and millet pasta and millet breads. My company is doing it, but it needs to be a lot more companies than just ours, of course. And so to me, this is like a matter of urgency, because we don't want to suddenly go, uh-oh, folks, you know, we're on our 3rd year of corn crop failures. That's happening right now, by the way. But why are we still planting corn? Like, why aren't we diversifying? Why aren't we adding more variety and more biodiversity to our fields to give it resiliency? And the reason why is because the market's not demanding it. So at the end of the day, that diversity on the plate drives that biodiversity in the field. And it's very important that we grow this consumer awareness around millets. And it's also why the UN has dedicated this year to being UN Year of Millets, and which is fantastic, because as you can see, this is a picture of like 4 of the products that my company Snacktivist makes. If you just looked at those, you would never guess they're not made out of the usual suspects. But these are all 100% gluten-free and vegan, and they are made from the waffle is predominantly made from teff. The bruschetta bread, the garlic bread there, is predominantly made out of sorghum. And the brownies and cookies are made from a blend of millet, sorghum, teff, and rice. So it's interesting how you start to go, wow, we really can innovate. Like, we can think outside the box so that we're driving biodiversity on the plate through consumer momentum. And I'm going to leave it at that because I tend to give really intense presentations. So I want to open up plenty of time for you guys to ask questions. And I will put in the chat my contact and stuff too, so you can reach out to me to learn more as well. Oh, whoops.
Okay. So if people want to come back on, so you can see, we can see your faces and you can ask questions. Thank you, Joni.
Yeah. I get kind of intense, so please feel free to ask questions, clarify, etc.
So folks want to raise your hand, or you can
I see
put it in the chat.
See a question from Alan. Sorry, I couldn't see the chat while I was talking because it was in presentation mode, so I couldn't see anything that's the screen. But what do you attribute the growth in food allergies to? Something in how foods are processed or hybridized? That's a fantastic question. I think there's a real variety of factors at play here. I do believe that processing and hybridization is definitely part of it, but I also think the overzealous use of broad spectrum herbicides like glyphosate or Roundup is also partially responsible because of the disruption to the gut microbiome. Also, intensive use of antibiotics, both in healthcare and in our food system, I believe drives and kind of sets the perfect situation for food sensitization to happen. So it's a combination of effects, but that's a tough one because it's like easier if there was one thing to blame, but I think in this it's like a perfect storm, if that makes sense. That's my personal opinion. Okay, where can we find millets and recipes that go with them? So also a really great question. So I know there's fantastic health food stores in Portland. Many health food stores, especially if they have a bulk bin area, they'll have whole bulk sorghum, and they'll also have whole bulk teff and millet frequently, or yeah, teff and millet. And what I like about those is that they're easy to find. You don't have to order them special. We frequently, like my kids their favorite is like, I'll take proso millet and I'll like just mix it with some basmati rice and just eat it like as a side dish. And so it's like you kind of get the rice experience, but with more millet. But like it doesn't scare the neighbor kids away when they are coming over for dinner and they've never had millet before. You know, it's like boiling a frog. Millets in general, like proso millet cooks up very quickly, just like white basmati rice, same time. And it makes a really good porridge, like for breakfast, things like that. You can use it floured and add it to things. Sorghum, on the other hand, is a little tricky. Sorghum takes a lot longer to cook. I actually cook it in the Instapot. I actually have a bag of sorghum one of my farmers just sent me for some testing. You probably can't see it. It's really big. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Not as big as this is a burgundy type, so it's higher in antioxidants than the others. We're gonna do some trials on that. But if you want to cook that, you need to plan ahead and like use like brown rice kind of, you know, cooking methods, and it's gonna take some time. Teff, on the other hand, it's poppy seed size, it cooks really fast, and it makes the best polenta. I think Terry's had my teff polenta before. It's good. It's really good. It's like polenta, but with the nutrition.
Joni,
So, yeah.
Joni, Betty Ann here she's had her hand up she wants to ask.
Oh, yeah. Okay, Betty.
I was just going to say, I lived in East Africa, in Tanzania for a couple of years, and I think I saw sorghum growing, but how would we have eaten it? I'm just trying to remember. Were you in East Africa or West?
No, I have not spent time in East Africa, but my understanding is that it's usually like split, like it's cracked, and it's cooked into like a porridge in that part of the world is the most common consumption, also fermented into alcohol.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I think we had sorghum pombe. That's right. Okay.
Yeah, it's really commonly used for fermentation purposes too. Yeah. Yep. And
a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just have a quick question. So when I go to like the co-ops, I'll usually just see it just says millet. So is that the prosum variety?
Yes, it's it's the proso. They almost always just call it millet. And it's kind of generally agreed in the United States, if it says millet, it's probably proso millet, but it gets really confusing because the second most widely consumed millet in the United States is foxtail millet. It's also just called millet. It totally looks different. It tastes different. It has different qualities. Foxtail has a lot of anti-diabetic properties, like significant anti-diabetic properties that it's being researched globally for at like adjunctive therapy, secondary to like other diabetes interventions. And that is actually grown in the United States, but not a single person processes it for sale. It's grown for, I know lots of farmers who grow it and they wish that they could harvest it and sell it, but there is no internal like market or manufacturing for those millets. So we're working on that. I buy it because I really like foxtail millet. I buy it online and it comes from India. Or if you have a good Asian import store, you'll almost always Chinese commonly consume foxtail millet. It's a very common Chinese food traditionally, and also Indian stores. Bob's Red Mill is an awesome place to get great recipes. Bob's Red Mill their website is fantastic, and their blogs, and they have a lot of good recipes for sorghum and millet and even teff.
You have another question?
I have a question. Is amaranth a millet?
You know, it's not considered a millet. Isn't that funny? In India, they call it a millet. And they all in India, when they talk about millets, they include amaranth, they include quinoa, they include a lot of different things. But in the United States, we do not include amaranth or chia or there's one more, buckwheat. We don't consider buckwheat a millet either. Amaranth is actually a broadleaf. It's a dicot. So it's not a monocot. It's not a grass. Yeah, and so that's one of the differentiations. Like buckwheat is also not a grass. It's a dicot. And so in the United States, we tend to consider anything called a millet is a monocot. It's a grass. hmm And they're all gluten-free. They are all, unless they've been cross-contaminated during manufacturing, which does happen. Usually it's in the harvest equipment that there's a cross-contamination event.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I'm just looking at these questions real quick. Oh, PROSO, Proso. I'm going to put that in there. Proso millet.
Also, Joni,
Okay.
Will has his hand up.
Yeah, Will. I see a link too. I'm going to open that up so I don't lose it for later.
Okay. Anyway, my question, or it's more a comment, is keyed around this concept you mentioned of true cost accounting.
Yes.
There's a point of view in the world that is sort of globally being bifurcating. There's a point of view that says we are in a system which is interrelated and we have to work on those interrelations, the whole
Yes.
picture, if you will, versus the
Yeah.
group that, yeah, that's all very fine, but I want to get mine before these other guys get theirs. A competitive point of view.
Correct. Yeah.
And so this is obviously toward the systems here, I would say, in terms of what's happening. Also looking at the whole picture and saying, hey, yeah, we can grow corn, but we can also grow millet as a cover crop and so on and so forth. And there's a bottom line type of approach to that. And I know that wheat farmers in Eastern Oregon tend to be politically conservative and more on the competitive side. What response do you get from them when you start talking about millets and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I do work with a number of farmers in Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington, and they are definitely all quite conservative. And what I've heard from them, the biggest driver is they're concerned about sovereignty, and they're wanting to create sovereign systems that don't have this dependency. And that's why they're looking for biodiversity to add to their system. And that's really getting their attention, is that, like the whole dependency on fertilizer coming from overseas. And they're also really interested in more drought resistant crops to give them more stability financially. Like if one crop fails, they have like a backup plan that's going to do well in really significant heat pressure or drought pressure like we've experienced the last few years. And so I get a lot of outreach from those farmers, and there's a few that are like, oh, bah humbug, but more and more all the time we're getting some really incredible traction. And what's funny is some of these farmers, like I'm the brand partnership manager for the Farm Smart group out of Spokane Conservation District, so we service the Palouse, and we do like biofarming methods. So it's not organic, but we use a lot of organic principles, and the guiding principles, if you follow them, you'll end up organic. And a couple of our farmers, one of them who's a great guy, but total good old boy, super conservative, and he kind of, organic. Well, guess what? He just called me up last fall and said, we're certifying 25% of our farm to organic. We don't even need that stuff anymore. Like, we just don't need it. And so he got to organic, not because he wanted to get there. He got there because he did really good soil management practices, added biodiversity. He grows Proso millet. And what do you know? He's organic. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
Such a cool story.
That's what you're talking with a person when they're talking to them where they live. They don't get political, they get practical.
Yeah, exactly. And I always say, like, climate's not a political issue when you're standing in a field. It's like suddenly like very tangible. You get practical, not political. And that's exactly right. Yeah.
I'm going to do another comment sort of thing. I put a couple of links into the chat. One is for Natural Capitalism Solutions, which is by a woman named Hunter Lovins, and her ex-husband, Amory Lovins, has an organization called Rocky Mountain Institute. And the URLs are to both of those guys. And I don't know if you've worked with them or know about them or not. But
I know of them, but that I don't know them. So I need to put this on my radar.
They are really investigating how do you get the dominant economy on board with this sort of practices in a way that's really important, incredibly important work. I think they both have been doing amazing stuff. And it's very much along the lines of what you're talking about. There's something called donut economics and other things. But carry on. Cool. Neat, interesting, fascinating thing.
Yeah, it really is. And there's so many people doing such great work in this to really mainstream and normalize a lot of these ideas, to bring them into more, like the modern folds. And in fact, I just had a call this morning with a woman who's very active in this world in regenerative ag. And they're working to create like a movie series that'll just be like normal, like, to really hit mainstream America, to talk about these more complex food system issues, but not through the lens of politics or anything, just more like through fascination and kind of fun character development, and like really trying to make it more normal and approachable, so that they don't feel like, oh, well, I'm not a granola cruncher, I can't eat that. We want it to be normal, right? So it's really a fun space to work in that way. Yeah, and I love the farmers I work with. It's just really, really amazing, the work that's being done. Yeah. I just wish I could buy more of their products. So we're growing. So if you have any, if you have any health food stores you love to shop at, be like, hey, get Snacktivist in here because we want to get millets. That always helps. Or like other millets, like there's some other fantastic innovators that are making like chips out of sorghum and other really cool stuff. So it's millet pastas. It's happening. Yeah. Mary, I saw you raise your hand for a second.
Yeah, I just want to say how fascinating this is and what a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
And it really, gosh, it totally makes sense what you're advocating for, and with the water use and all of that. I'm wondering does millet, is it carrying like a price premium? Is that something that the farmers can sort of say, yeah, we're going to be able to sell it for more per ton than corn, or not really?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because both millet and sorghum kind of follow corn in the futures market. So where corn goes, it always reacts to corn prices because of the significance in livestock feed and helping to fill gaps for animal feed. And so like our farmers, they really want to produce millet for human consumption, because if they're selling it into animal, it's very, very low margin, very, very low cost. Granted, they don't have to clean it. It can be dirty, all of that stuff. But, for instance, when I look at like the cost of sorghum, because we buy sorghum and I buy it directly from a farmer in Nebraska. So that means I have to haul it, I have to mill it, I have to do all that stuff. But I am paying like really comparable prices to wheat if I were to buy wheat from farmers. And so what's interesting is that these crops have potential to be very price competitive. It's just that the market structures are not there to facilitate it moving to market at scale. And that's where most of the cost comes from. Prosa millet does not have the yields that sorghum or wheat or corn do, so it is slightly higher. And farmers are always looking to sell it into premium markets because it's not going to have the test weight and the yield, and so it does need to carry a higher price per pound. But even still, it's not extraordinarily expensive, which is cool. These are very economical crops, and what's fascinating to me is when I talk to my farmers where they're saving money by adding these crops in, is that they're filling a gap that brings in an additional income stream, but it's not costing them a lot of money in fertilizer, and it's not costing them a lot of money in like, they're saving money on tillage, they're saving money on other things. So again, that's why that true cost accounting picture is so important, because they realize that they're making money from what they're not doing. And so and that by adding the diversity helps to promote that bigger system play towards profitability.
And it seems like we'd be a lot smarter, if you're going to eat a cow, which I don't do, but if you're going to, it'd be better to feed them sorghum, it seems like, if it's a grass, because one of the reasons why meat is so unhealthy for you is because, and why the cows emit so much methane is because they're eating corn. And
they're eating horrible quality
grasses,
corn.
right?
Yes.
They evolved to eat grasses, so they can't digest the corn. It's just ridiculous, our whole system. But
I know it's so set up in such a weird way when you really think about it. It's like, doesn't make sense economically, or from a health perspective, or from like a climate perspective. And so with cattle and CAFOs and whatnot, there's been some early studies, because sorghum used to be the dominant overwinter feed for cattle in Nebraska, Iowa, etc., until the 70s. And when the corn lobby actually pushed that through and mandated that all CAFO feedlots had to use corn and didn't use sorghum anymore, killed the sorghum industry. Yeah, it was a political move. And it was fueled by the backers of the intellectual property of the high yield corn, and then the glyphosate, which is needed to grow corn like that.
Right,
So it was a
Monsanto.
very, yeah, it was a very politically motivated thing. But what's interesting now is like, I have a friend who works in the industry who's been able to do some really cool studies where he last year did it wasn't like a study, it was more like a meta-analysis that he collected. And he was working on proso millet in chicken feed. And what he did is he collected the data from chicken feed using corn feed, which is what they normally are eating in the CAFOs, like the corn, the chicken houses in the Midwest eat mostly corn. And he took it down to the water use. And if they switch to proso millet, they will save 16 gallons of water per egg.
Wow.
Oh my
Wow.
Per egg.
Per egg.
It's that significant of a water difference. And then he was working on, and I don't know if he's gotten this yet, but looking at the nutritional complement, like actually the nutrition of the egg as a result of not just eating GMO corn, but eating proso, which has a better nutritional profile. And our guess is that it's better, not as good as a pastured egg, of course, but like just the water savings alone really got my attention. That you're like, I mean, you do the math of a 12 pack of eggs, that's a lot of water savings. Yeah. And water is the new gold, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hope.
So Suzanne has her hand up.
Oh,
Yes.
Suzanne, hi.
Hi. Would you talk about these grains and gluten?
Yeah. So all of these grains are naturally gluten-free crops. They separated from the wheat lineage and barley lineage like millions of years ago in the wild. So they don't make any gluten at all, or any gliadin, or any of that protein sweet that tends to be an issue for people with celiac and autoimmune. So unless they've been cross-contaminated, they're safe for celiacs. Yeah, which is great. So fantastic. I mean, 20% of households avoid gluten, so it's a really important thing these days.
Thank you.
Yeah, Hope.
So this is just a quick comment and then a question. So
Yeah.
the comment is that 50 plus years ago, when my sons were babies, they had allergies, and we started using gluten and other grains back then, grinding almonds to make milk because they couldn't have gluten or dairy. And at the time, there was a cookbook by the Seventh-day Adventists called the 10 Talents Cookbook. And I have no idea if it's still produced, but that was what we used for most of our recipes.
Wow.
So this is like in 1968 to the mid 70s.
Oh
And,
my gosh, the 10
fun-
talents. I'm going to look
10
that up.
Talents Cookbook by the Seventh-day. And the funniest memory I have of during that time is Grandpa Sasek visiting once. This is my husband's father, who was a meat and potatoes farmer. And I made this millet porridge for breakfast one morning, and he says, "Oh my God, Hope, what are you feeding me? This is bird seed." So,
You're like,
you
it's good stuff.
it is good stuff. So now we're not the only family eating it. Then the other question I have is not about your presentation, but it's actually about your website. Because after you finished, when we were just asking questions, because I'd never heard of Snacktivist before, I went on the website to try to order several gift things for each of my sons.
Thank you.
And for some reason, I didn't do the order because it won't let me add like a gift note that says why the word. So I don't know if that's not working.
You know, we're in the process of changing the website. So it's like being redone on the back end. So I think there's a few things that might be kind of glitchy because we're actually launching all new branding. And we took down a lot of our content off our website because we're rebuilding it all out. And so I would be happy just relay the message on to the team if you wanted to email it to us. And because my guess is it's just app is not working because of the back end stuff that we're doing. I tell you, the technology is the hardest part of this.
Well, I'll write down your email. I would like to send it to the kids directly, although they live near me. It's easier for me than having stuff that's a little bit heavy sent to my house.
I totally agree. And my team that does all the fulfillment is fantastic. And they're always happy to give the final touch. We can wrap things for people like, you know, I mean, we're in
I
it.
saw that. I was really, willing to pay for wrap and all, but then every time I would do something, then it would just pop me out, and then it would say it was out
Oh,
of
shoot.
product or something. I thought, it's not
Yeah.
that product.
Okay.
Anyway, okay, well, I
Yeah.
will send you.
Hey,
Yeah,
Joni,
hello@snacktivistfoods.com will get you in the right direction. So
Okay.
yeah.
we have
Thank
to
you.
wrap this up, but I wonder, I didn't hear you, and maybe you did it at the very beginning to mention something about
Nama.
NAMA. Yeah, and then we
Yes.
goodbye.
Yeah, we probably should. So again, there's the snacktivistfoods.com. I mentioned that I'm the co-founder of North American Millets Alliance, and we're a group. We're not structured as a nonprofit or anything. We're literally just a group right now that are like advocates, but we're really trying to grow the awareness about what millets are. We're hosting a year-long webinar series. So every month there's an educational webinar. We're also going to have some panels, like we're going to have one about just human nutrition. We're going to have one that's about, product development and innovation. And so if you want to learn more about NAMA, if you follow us on Facebook or LinkedIn, and then let me just cut and paste our website here. We're actually building a new website for that too, so it makes it kind of tricky. I need to clone myself.
So Joni, one other suggestion for it is this recording is going to be on Northeast Village's website, as well as
Oh, cool.
Yeah, we have a couple of places where it's going to be. And so in the description, I can include the website for on air. Okay.
Oh, that's perfect. And then I'll put it in the chat too.
I know where to get it.
Okay, cool. I finally found it, and here's that one too. But thank you, Terry. I appreciate that. We are in the process of getting a brand new website, but it's probably going to be a little while before we get published. So yeah, so millets2023.space. And then UN Year of Millets, there's a lot of cool content out there. If you Google search United Nations Year of Millets 2023, there's like incredible stuff happening around the world. And it actually makes you realize like the amount of innovation that's happening in India and Africa. And it's just astounding. It's really astounding. It's really fun, and it's a really optimistic group of people. So yeah, so thanks so much for listening, everybody. It was fun.
Thank you, Joni. Really appreciate you taking the time. Super informative,
Sure.
as usual. Yay.
Yeah.
I get kind of nerdy, so thanks for bearing with me. And yeah, if you want to reach out to me, that hello@snacktivistfoods.com is a good one. That goes to my team so they can make sure that I would get it and respond to it. And then I'm really responsive on LinkedIn or even on like Facebook or Instagram, Snacktivist Foods. So yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a good one.
Day.
Bye.